The atmosphere inside the Oval Office is typically heavy with historical significance, but on this specific winter afternoon, it carried a weight that was far more urgent and menacing. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, walked into the room displaying the rehearsed assurance of a man who was convinced he represented the future of the Democratic Party. He was clad in a Tom Ford suit priced higher than what most Americans pay for their monthly mortgage. His hair combed back with a structural exactness that resisted the wind. Appearing every bit the media favorite who had adorned the covers of GQ and Rolling Stone, he arrived in Washington anticipating a standard partisan conflict. He expected a piece of political theater where he could establish himself as the brave leader of the resistance standing firm against the federal administration. He had practiced his opening remarks during the flight, formulating sound bites tailored for the evening news, ready to lecture the president on California's economic power and progressive resume. He felt invulnerable, shielded by his state's massive economy and his position as the assumed frontrunner for the 2028 nomination. Newsom hardly paused to reach the chairs facing the resolute desk before beginning his prepared speech, his voice carrying the smooth, nearly patronizing tone he kept for political rivals he considered beneath him. "Mr. President, I will be blunt," Newsom started, gesturing with a perfectly manicured hand. "I am not entirely certain why I have been called here today. California is prospering despite your administration's persistent efforts at federal interference, and our economy remains the fifth largest in the world while driving the national engine. We are leading the country on climate initiatives, on diversity, and on innovation. If this meeting is merely about you being jealous that we are succeeding without your assistance or an attempt to show off for your base, I truly do not have time for petty political games." He stopped speaking, waiting for the anticipated interruption, ready to counter with another prepared retort. "Sit down, Gavin." President Trump's voice sliced through the governor's monologue like a diamond cutter moving through glass. It was not yelled, nor was it angry, but it was the absolute steady voice of someone who possessed immense power in that specific moment and knew precisely how to utilize it. The interruption paralyzed Newsom in the middle of his gesture, causing the governor to blink as his rehearsed smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. He looked around the room, finally truly observing the scene, and realized this was not the standard political meeting he had expected. Trump was not surrounded by political advisors or communication staff. Instead, behind the resolute desk, flanking the president like silent guardians of federal authority, stood the architects of Newsom's downfall. To Trump's right stood FBI Director Christopher Wray, his face a mask of professional detachment, his hands resting on 3 thick black binders labeled with classified headers. Next to him was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, looking less like a political appointee and more like a forensic accountant getting ready to dissect a failing asset, armed with stacks of financial audit documents. Completing the grim trio was HUD Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis, a career auditor whose entire professional life was founded on locating missing government funds, holding sheets of statistical analysis regarding California's homelessness expenditures. All three appeared grim, professional, and entirely uninterested in political debate, creating an atmosphere in the Oval Office that was not one of negotiation, but the cold, sterile environment of a prosecution table just before opening arguments. Newsom, still attempting to hold the upper hand, let out a practiced, dismissive laugh and remained standing, trying to project a dominance he no longer felt. "Oh, come on," he said, looking from Ray to Trump. "What is this, some type of performance art? Is this petty revenge for the 2020 election cycles? I am not intimidated by props, Mr. President, so if you want to have a serious conversation about policy, I am here. But if this is just theater, I have a state to manage." Trump did not take the bait, nor did he raise his voice. He simply leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. $68 billion, Trump said, and the number landed in the quiet room like a physical weight. I'm sorry, Newsom said, momentarily thrown off his script. Trump repeated the number slowly and clearly, $68 billion. That is the exact amount of taxpayer money the state of California has spent on homelessness programs since you took office in 2019. $68 billion in federal funds, state funds, and local funds that pass through your administration's budgetary control. Trump paused, allowing the sheer magnitude of the figure to sink in. Now, that is a staggering amount of money, Gavin, and you could rebuild entire cities for that sum. But here is the interesting part. Do you want to know what happened to your homeless population during that exact same period while you were spending all that cash? Trump did not wait for an answer. It increased by 46%, meaning nearly 50% more people are living in tents on sidewalks and under overpasses despite $68 billion injected into the system to stop it. With a single finger, Trump pushed one of the thick folders across the polished surface of the Resolute desk until it rested inches from where Newsom was standing. The cover of the folder was plain, but the contents were devastating. So I am going to ask you a very simple question, Gavin, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer, Trump said, his eyes locking onto the governor's. Or where did $68 billion go? Because it certainly did not go to the people on the streets. Newsom's confident smile finally developed a genuine crack, a small hairline fracture in the expensive porcelain of his public persona. For the first time since he entered the White House grounds, Gavin Newsom realized he had absolutely no idea what he had walked into. Trump did not wait for Newsom to regain his footing. He leaned back in the high-backed leather chair, his expression one of clinical observation rather than anger. I will tell you exactly where it went, Trump continued, his voice steady and unrelenting. It didn't disappear into thin air. It went to your major political donors. It went to nonprofits run by your campaign fundraisers. And it went to consulting firms that kick a portion of that money right back into your political operation. You have been systematically looting the California taxpayer while people are literally dying on the sidewalks of San Francisco and Los Angeles. While the middle class is fleeing your state in record numbers because they cannot afford the rent, you were treating the homelessness crisis like a personal ATM for your 2028 ambitions. And the best part, Gavin, is that I can prove every single word of it. FBI Director Christopher Wray stepped forward, his movement precise and deliberate. He opened the first of the thick binders, laying out a series of documents on the Resolute desk with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned prosecutor. Governor Newsom, Wray began, his tone devoid of any political animosity, which made it all the more terrifying. For the past 8 months, at the president's direction, the FBI has been conducting a comprehensive multi-agency forensic audit of every major homelessness contract California has awarded since your inauguration. This hasn't been a cursory glance at the books. We have looked at every line item, every wire transfer, and every shell company involved in the process. We have identified $23 billion in what we can now categorize as provably fraudulent spending. Newsom's posture finally began to betray him. He didn't just sit. He sank into the chair, the $1,500 suit suddenly looking like a weight he was not strong enough to carry. The golden boy of the West Coast was staring at bank records, contract awards, and corporate filings that he had assumed were buried under layers of state bureaucracy. Wray pointed to a specific page detailing no-bid contracts. We have the paper trail of state contracts awarded to companies owned by your top political donors, companies with no prior experience in housing or social services. We have evidence of massively inflated billing for services that were never rendered, and strategic consulting fees that were nothing more than laundered kickbacks flowing directly into political action committees you control. This isn't speculation, Governor. It is a roadmap of a criminal enterprise. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent followed, his voice crisp and professional as he introduced a new set of documents. While the homelessness fraud is the largest piece of the puzzle, we have also looked into your personal financial interests, he said, pulling up the records of Newsom's private business ventures. Your family's wine businesses, the Plumpjack Group, Odette Estate, and Cade Winery have received $47 million in state contracts, tax breaks, and agricultural subsidies since you became governor. This is textbook self-dealing, as you have used your executive authority to directly enrich your private interests, often through agencies whose heads you personally appointed. Under California law, that is a violation of the government code, but under federal law, it is straight-up fraud. HUD Inspector General Ray Oliver Davis delivered the final crushing blow. On top of the self-dealing, we have tracked $340 million in wire transfers from state contractors directly into a series of shell LLCs, Davis noted, her finger tracing a flowchart of money movement that ended with Newsom's political operation. These aren't campaign contributions that follow FEC rules. These are illegal wire transfers of taxpayer money disguised as business expenses. That is money laundering, Gavin, and because this pattern of behavior involves multiple people, multiple agencies, and has occurred consistently over several years, it qualifies for a federal RICO prosecution. The word RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, seemed to drain the remaining life from Newsom's face. It was the law used to dismantle the mafia, the ultimate weapon of the federal government against organized crime. Trump let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching as Newsom's eyes darted between the three investigators. The governor's hands were now gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that the leather groaned. He looked like a man who had just been told his entire world had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. "So here is how this is going to go, Gavin," Trump said, his voice dropping to a quieter, more personal level. "You are going to make a decision right now that determines whether you spend a few years in a comfortable state facility or the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary. You are at a crossroads, and I am only going to give you two options. There is no third way. There is no spinning this to your friends at the New York Times. And there is no resistance speech that saves you from a RICO indictment." Trump held up one finger. Option one is you resign as governor of California today, effective immediately. You go back to Sacramento, you cite personal or health reasons, or whatever lie helps you sleep at night, and you face the state-level corruption charges. You take a plea deal with the California Attorney General, you serve maybe 6 years, and you are out before you are 60. Your political career is dead, but you are a free man in a few years. He then held up a second finger. Option two is you walk out of this room thinking you can fight me, thinking your media friends can protect you, and tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., I stand in the Rose Garden, and I release every single page of this audit to the public. Every wire transfer, every fraudulent contract, every email, and then the DOJ files RICO charges. You will be looking at 25 years to life, meaning you will be 70 years old before you even smell fresh air again. And Gavin, federal RICO defendants don't go to Club Fed. They go to real prisons with real criminals. Newsom tried to speak, but his voice was a weak, thin rasp as he stammered, You can't possibly prove—" His attempt at defiance died in his throat as Trump pushed another stack of documents toward him. "We have the bank records," Trump said flatly. "We have the emails, we have the text messages, and most importantly, we have the people. We have offered immunity to several of your contractors, and they are singing like canaries. They have given us the dates, the amounts, and the names of the people in your office who directed the kickbacks. This isn't a bluff, Gavin. It is a funeral for your ambitions. So what is it going to be? Do you want to resign quietly, or do you want to be destroyed on national television?" The silence in the Oval Office was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very breath out of Gavin Newsom. For a man who had built his entire career on a foundation of charisma, polished rhetoric, and the ability to spin any crisis into a political victory, The reality of the documents sitting on the resolute desk was a finality he was not prepared for. His mind, usually a high-speed processor of tactical maneuvers, was currently stalled and caught in a loop of the word RICO. He looked at the binders, 3 massive volumes of evidence, and realized that the golden boy of California was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, and the trap had been bolted shut. "You need to understand the scale of what we are looking at," FBI Director Wray said, breaking the silence with a voice that was as cold as a winter morning in the Sierras. "To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to look back at the last 8 months. While you were doing photo ops at the French Laundry or giving speeches about the California way, my agents were deep in the plumbing of your state's financial systems. We didn't just look at the high-level budget numbers, we tracked the movement of cents. We mapped the connections between your campaign's largest contributors and the sudden appearance of multi-million-dollar no-bid contracts." Trump watched Newsom closely, his eyes sharp and analytical. He wasn't gloating, but rather observing the collapse of a rival with the detached interest of a building inspector watching a faulty structure finally give way. "You thought you were smarter than everyone else, Gavin," Trump said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. "You thought that because you had the media in your pocket and a supermajority in Sacramento, you could treat the state's treasury like your personal trust fund. But $68 billion is a lot of money to lose, and people notice when you spend that kind of cash, and the only thing that grows is the size of the tent cities on the 101. I became personally obsessed with it as a businessman because the math didn't work. It was impossible for it to be anything other than a massive, organized theft." Wray flipped to a section of the binder marked with a bright red Phase 1 tab. "Let's talk about the 12 hours before you walked into this room," he suggested. 12 hours ago, you woke up in the governor's mansion in Sacramento. You were sipping an expensive espresso, and you were looking at polling data that showed you with a 73% approval rating among California Democrats. You were reading profiles of yourself in glossy magazines being hailed as the future of the resistance. You received the summons for this meeting and dismissed it as bureaucratic noise. Your chief of staff, Jennifer Newsom, expressed caution, but you waved her off. You actually told her Trump is flailing. This is just him trying to intimidate the frontrunner for 2028. And you were so blinded by your own reflection that you couldn't see the federal investigator standing right outside your door." Wray continued, his finger jabbing at a flowchart that looked like a spiderweb of corruption. "While you were getting your hair done for this meeting, the Treasury and the FBI were finalizing the Mogadishu map of your homelessness spending. We found $23 billion with a B, that went to contracts with clear fraud indicators. We are talking about no-bid awards to companies with no employees, and we are talking about consulting firms that were nothing more than a PO. Box in a strip mall. One specific example is California Housing Solutions, a nonprofit that received $340 million to build 400 units of housing. Gavin, that is $850,000 per unit for a basic studio in a converted motel. And even in your state, the math is impossible. We traced $280 million of that money. It didn't go to lumber or labor. It went to firms owned by your former campaign managers and major donors. Treasury Secretary Besant added her own layer to the indictment. "And it wasn't just the large-scale political theft," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "It was the personal greed. Your wine businesses, Plumpjack, Odette, Cade, received $47 million in state contracts and subsidies. You thought the blind trust would protect you, but we found the emails and the text messages between your office and the agency heads you appointed, directing them to favor your wineries for state functions. You were charging the taxpayers double the market rate for your own wine, and you were using agricultural subsidies meant for struggling farmers to install luxury water systems at your estate wineries. It is the kind of blatant self-dealing that would get a CEO fired and jailed in a heartbeat. Newsom's hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that he couldn't hide even by gripping the armrests. The walls of the Oval Office, which had once seemed like the inevitable destination of his career, now felt like they were closing in. He looked at the HUD Inspector General, who was presenting statistics on homeless deaths, mortality rates that had increased 48% under his watch. The reality was being stripped of its political polish. He wasn't being accused of a policy failure, he was being accused of a body count. The money that should have saved Jennifer Martinez, the bankrupt teacher, or Marcus Johnson, the veteran with PTSD, had instead been used to fund his 2028 polling and his inner circle's lifestyle. Trump leaned forward, his shadow falling across the documents on the desk. The offer is on the table, Gavin, and you have one chance. You resign tonight. You go home and tell whatever story you want to the people of California. You face the state AG. You serve your 6 years, and you walk away with your life. Or you walk out of here, and tomorrow the FBI files the RICO indictment. You will spend the next 30 years in a cell watching your children grow up through a glass partition while the world remembers you as the man who stole from the poorest of the poor. You have 60 seconds to decide. 60 seconds until the federal government ends the Newsom legacy forever. The silence in the room was deafening as the 60-second countdown began. Gavin Newsom, once the poised and polished face of the California dream, looked like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years. The fluorescent lights of the Oval Office reflected off his slicked-back hair, but the confident glint in his eyes had been replaced by a vacant, haunted stare. He looked down at his hands, which were now trembling uncontrollably on his lap. He thought of his wife, Jennifer, and their children. He thought of the glossy magazine covers and the applause of the crowds in Sacramento. All of it was evaporating in the clinical cold air of the room, replaced by the grim reality of a prison cell. 10 seconds, Gavin, Trump said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't need to, for he knew exactly how much pressure he was applying. Newsom looked up, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words that would officially end his life as he knew it. The $1,500 suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket, and the weight of the $23 billion in documented fraud seemed to press down on his chest. He looked at FBI Director Wray, then at Secretary Bessent, seeking even a hint of mercy or a crack in their professional resolve. He found none. They were the architects of an airtight cage, and he was finally inside it. I'll resign, Newsom whispered, the words sounding like ashes in his mouth. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, for the golden boy had finally broken. Trump didn't gloat, nor did he offer a celebratory smile. He simply nodded to the White House counsel, who stepped forward with a single sheet of paper. It was a pre-drafted resignation letter with a blank space for the governor's signature. "Good decision, Gavin," Trump said, his tone turning into one of brisk, business-like finality. "It is the only one that doesn't end with you dying in a federal penitentiary, so you will sign this now, and it will be released to the press at 11 p.m. tonight." Newsom took the silver pen offered to him, his fingers fumbling with the weight of it. As he pressed the nib to the paper, he realized he wasn't just signing a letter. He was signing the death warrant of his presidential ambitions, his reputation, and his freedom. He scrawled his signature, the same elegant script that had authorized billions in fraudulent contracts, and watched as the ink dried. The room felt marginally lighter, the immediate threat of a RICO indictment receding just enough to allow him to breathe. Though the shadow of the state-level corruption charges still loomed large, he was no longer the leader of the resistance. "Here is what happens next," Trump said, pulling the signed letter back across the desk. "You go back to your hotel, you don't call the media, you don't call your donors, you call your family, At 11 p.m., the story breaks that you are resigning for personal and health reasons, and tomorrow morning, the California Attorney General will receive the referral from our investigators. You will negotiate your plea deal for the 10 years, serve your 6, and you will fade away. If you try to change the narrative, if you try to play the victim on cable news, or you even whispered the word persecution, the deal is off, and we file the RICO charges the next hour. Do you understand? Newsom nodded silently, unable to look the president in the eye. He stood up on shaky legs. The poise that had defined his career completely vanished. He looked small, scared, and trapped as he turned to leave the Oval Office. The Secret Service detail that had escorted him in moved into position to lead him out, not as a visiting dignitary, but as a man under the watchful eye of the law. He walked through the West Wing, past the portraits of past leaders, realizing that his own portrait would forever be associated with the $68 billion that vanished while his state burned. The California way had led him directly into a trap of his own making, and the exit was a long, dark tunnel toward a prison gate. The news of the resignation broke at exactly 11 p.m. Eastern Time, an hour carefully chosen to catch the late-night news cycles on the East Coast and the primetime audiences in California. The White House press office released a terse, 3-paragraph statement that sent the global media into a state of instantaneous, frenzied activity. The statement claimed that Governor Gavin Newsom had tendered his resignation to the California Secretary of State effective immediately, citing unforeseen personal and health-related challenges that required his full and undivided attention. It was a masterpiece of political vagueness designed to provide a temporary shroud of legitimacy while the federal government's investigators stood back, their binders of evidence tucked away for the time being. Within minutes, the vibrant, high-energy world of California politics was plunged into a state of absolute, bewildered chaos. In Sacramento, the state capital, the atmosphere was one of profound, unadulterated shock. Staffers in the governor's office, many of whom had spent the day preparing for routine legislative sessions or upcoming fundraisers, were seen staring at television monitors in disbelief. Some stood still, holding half-drunk cups of coffee as the golden boy of the West Coast, the man who had survived a recall attempt and was widely viewed as the inevitable successor to the Democratic throne, had simply vanished from the political stage in a single evening. The legislative halls, usually buzzing with the business of the nation's most populous state, became ghost towns as rumors began to swirl like a wildfire in the dry hills. Journalists from the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle scrambled to their bureaus, frantically calling every contact they had in the governor's inner circle, only to find a wall of silence. The personal health narrative was being questioned almost as soon as it was uttered, with political analysts pointing out that Newsom had appeared in peak physical condition just hours earlier during his televised arrival at the White House. Across the country, the political shockwaves were equally intense. In Washington, D.C., the party leadership was caught in a crossfire of panic and confusion. Many of the party's most senior officials had tied their own political fortunes to the Newsom legacy, viewing him as the bulwark against the Trump administration's agenda. To see him resign so abruptly, and on the heels of a closed-door meeting in the Oval Office, suggested a collapse of a much more systemic and catastrophic nature. Republican lawmakers, meanwhile, were cautious, many sensing that the health reasons were merely a tactical retreat before a larger legal storm. The 24-hour news networks pivoted their entire coverage to the Newsom resignation, bringing on medical experts to speculate on invisible illnesses and political insiders to guess at hidden scandals. But the real story remained locked behind the doors of the West Wing, where the digital signatures and wire transfer records were being prepared for their final journey to the California Attorney General. As the midnight hour passed in California, the physical reality of the transition began to take place. Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis was summoned to an emergency session to be briefed on her immediate swearing-in. The process was somber and hurried, a stark contrast to the celebratory inaugurations of the past. Kounalakis, a longtime ally of Newsom, appeared before a small pool of cameras, looking as stunned as the public she was now tasked with leading. Her brief remarks focused on continuity and stability, but her eyes betrayed the unease of a leader inheriting a state whose foundation was being quietly dismantled by federal investigators. In the streets of San Francisco and Los Angeles, the news was met with a mixture of confusion and a strange, simmering hope. Among those who had grown disillusioned with the $68 billion failure to address the homelessness crisis, they didn't know about the RICO threat or the plumpjack contracts yet, but they knew that the status quo had been shattered. The most telling scenes, however, occurred far from the public eye. At his hotel in Washington, Gavin Newsom sat in a darkened suite, the lights of the city flickering below him. He was no longer the confident statesman. He was a man waiting for the sun to rise on a life he no longer recognized. He had made the calls he needed to make to his wife, his closest family, and his legal team. And each conversation had been a variation of the same tragic realization. The $1,500 suit was draped over a chair, a discarded relic of a persona that had been exposed as a hollow shell. He watched the cable news coverage of his own illness, listening to the pundits praise his courageous decision to put family first. For a moment, he might have believed he had a chance to escape, but then he looked at the burner phone on the table, the direct line to the White House counsel, and remembered the 60-second countdown. The deal was signed, the trap was set, and the California way was about to meet the American justice system. By the early morning of the following day, the narrative began to shift from if Newsom would resign to why he had done so with such terrifying speed. Investigative reporters, already suspicious of the timing, began digging into the flight manifests of the FBI and Treasury officials who had been spotted in D.C. that afternoon. They began to notice the strange coincidences, the sudden quietude of major California contractors, the freezing of certain offshore accounts, and the unusual activity at the state's homelessness task force. The personal health lie was a dam that was beginning to crack under the pressure of 1,000 questions. Gavin Newsom's resignation wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the opening act of a multi-billion-dollar criminal reckoning that was about to change the face of California politics forever. The Golden Boy had stepped off the stage, but the lights were only getting brighter, and they were pointed directly at the $68 billion hole he had left behind. The announcement of criminal charges against Gavin Newsom didn't come from a federal building in Washington, but from a crowded press room in Sacramento, delivered by California Attorney General Rob Bonta. The irony was thick enough to choke the room, as Bonta, a longtime ally and appointee of the former governor, stood behind a podium adorned with the state seal, his face a mask of somber professional duty. He began by acknowledging the unprecedented and painful nature of the moment, but stated that the evidence uncovered by a joint federal-state task force left the Department of Justice with no other path. The indictment was a massive document totaling over 80 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and public corruption. But the narrative it wove was surprisingly simple. The $68 billion meant for California's most vulnerable had instead been used to build a multi-layered political and personal empire. The core of the pay-to-play scheme, as Bonta detailed, centered on the strategic awarding of homelessness contracts to a select circle of Newsom's most prolific donors. The Attorney General pulled up a list of the state's top 50 political contributors between 2019 and 2024, a who's who of California's tech elite, real estate moguls, and powerful lobbyists. He then overlaid that list with a database of state contract awards. The correlation was a mathematical nightmare for the defense, as those 50 donors had received nearly $5 billion in state contracts, a return on investment of over $56 for every single dollar they had donated to Newsom's campaigns and associated PACs. Bonta described this as a systematic business investment in the governor's office where taxpayer funds were treated as a commodity, to be traded for political loyalty and campaign cash. As the details began to leak through the afternoon, the specific mechanics of the kickback loop were revealed. It wasn't as crude as cash in envelopes. It was a sophisticated laundering operation that used strategic consulting firms as the primary filter. A nonprofit would receive a massive no-bid state contract to build supportive housing at a vastly inflated rate, often upwards of $800,000 per unit. That nonprofit would then hire consulting firms owned by Newsom's former staffers or campaign associates, paying them millions in oversight fees for work that, according to FBI interviews, never actually occurred. Those firms would then turn around and make massive independent expenditures to support Newsom's political agenda. The money was a closed circle traveling from the state treasury to a donor-run nonprofit, through a politically connected consultant, and back into the governor's re-election machine. The personal enrichment aspect of the indictment was perhaps the most damaging to Newsom's public image, stripping away the servant leader mask to reveal a pattern of blatant greed. Secretary Bessent's forensic audit of the Plumpjack Group and the associated wineries became a focal point of the leak. The records showed that while Newsom had placed the businesses in a blind trust, he had personally appointed the heads of the agencies that proceeded to grant those very businesses $47 million in illegal subsidies, tax breaks, and exclusive wine service contracts for state events. The blind trust, it appeared, had been wide open, with emails showing Newsom's senior staff directing agency heads to ensure the governor's wineries were taken care of during budget negotiations. The image of the French Laundry governor was replaced by the Plumpjack billionaire, a man who used his office to ensure his family's wealth grew while his state's middle class was hollowed out. By late afternoon, the human cost of the fraud was being broadcast across every news network as the FBI began releasing video interviews with homeless individuals who had been failed by the system. These weren't political pundits. They were people like Jennifer Martinez, a former teacher who had slept on a Los Angeles sidewalk for 3 years while a nonprofit just miles away sat on $340 million of unused state funds. The mortality statistics were the final haunting metric of the case. Homeless deaths in California had increased nearly 50% during Newsom's tenure, a figure that federal investigators tied directly to the theft of the funds that should have provided medical care and emergency shelter. This isn't just about white-collar crime, one investigator noted to the press. This is about a body count funded by taxpayer dollars. The fallout within the Democratic Party was instantaneous and brutal. In a coordinated effort to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of the Newsom legacy, national party leaders began returning donations and scrubbing the former governor's image from their official websites. The Golden Boy had become a cautionary tale, a political leper whose touch was now seen as a death sentence for any 2028 ambition. Even as Newsom sat in his hotel room in D.C., feeling the legal and political walls close in, the realization was finally sinking in. The $1,500 suit and the perfectly styled hair couldn't protect him from the weight of $68 billion in missing money. The California way had come to an end in a Sacramento press room, and the trial of the century was only just beginning. The walls of Gavin Newsom's Washington hotel suite felt like they were shrinking, the opulence of the room now a mocking contrast to the clinical gray of the fate awaiting him. For 48 hours, the personal health narrative had served as a fragile dam, holding back a deluge of federal evidence that was already leaking through the cracks of the 24-hour news cycle. He had spent the night in a feverish loop of phone calls with his elite legal team, men who charged $1,000 an hour to tell him exactly what he didn't want to hear. The federal government wasn't bluffing. The wire transfers were documented, the immunity deals with his former contractors were signed, and the blind trust was being treated as a transparent lie by forensic accountants. The 60-second clock Trump had started in the Oval Office was still ticking in Newsom's head, a rhythmic reminder that every hour he spent clinging to a policy defense brought him closer to a life sentence in a federal penitentiary. The final realization came when his lead counsel, a former high-ranking DOJ official, laid out the grim mathematics of a RICO prosecution. "Gavin, if we walk into a federal court, we aren't just fighting about wine subsidies," the lawyer had said, his voice flat. "We are fighting a racketeering case involving $23 billion in fraud and a systematic criminal enterprise. The conviction rate for federal RICO cases is over 90%, and if you lose, and with the witnesses they have, you will lose, you are going to die in a cage. You'll be 75 years old before you're even eligible for a hearing." The Golden Boy finally looked at the choice for what it was: an off-ramp into a decade of shame or a high-speed collision with the full weight of the United States government. He didn't have the stomach for a 30-year war. He picked up the secure phone to the White House counsel and signaled his surrender. The plea negotiations that followed were conducted with the cold efficiency of a corporate liquidation. Trump's administration held all the leverage, and they used it to ensure that the Newsom legacy was not just defeated, but dismantled. The deal was brutal in its simplicity. Newsom would waive his right to a trial and plead guilty to 5 core counts of state-level fraud, embezzlement, and public corruption. In exchange for the federal government dropping the RICO charges and the life sentence threat, Newsom would provide full and honest cooperation regarding the network of contractors and consultants who had facilitated the kickback schemes. He was essentially being asked to hand over the keys to the entire political machine that had built him, a final act of betrayal that would ensure no one in his inner circle could ever rise to power again. As the terms were finalized, the financial wreckage of the governor's life became apparent. The deal required an immediate forfeiture of $28 million in restitution. Money, the state argued, was directly tied to the illegal benefits his wine businesses had received. His personal wealth, once estimated at over $20 million, was effectively wiped out by the combination of fines, restitution, and the astronomical legal fees he had incurred trying to fight the inevitable. He wasn't just losing his freedom. He was being systematically stripped of the resources that had allowed him to move through the world with such aristocratic ease. The $1,500 suits would be replaced by state-issued denim, and the Napa Valley views would be replaced by the sterile yard of a medium-security facility. The most agonizing part of the process for Newsom was the public admission of guilt. He had spent 20 years perfecting the art of the non-apology apology, the practiced deflection that turned every mistake into a learning opportunity or a partisan attack. But the plea agreement required him to stand in a courtroom and admit on the record that he had intentionally diverted funds meant for the homeless to enrich his donors and himself. There would be no spin, no context, and no health-related excuses. He would have to look at the evidence of the $850,000 studio units and admit they were a front for a criminal conspiracy. The man who wanted to be president was being forced to admit he was a thief. By the end of the week, the stage was set for the final act. Newsom's team had reached an agreement with the California Attorney General's office, overseen by the federal observers. The sentence was locked in: 10 years in a state facility with a likely release after 6 years for good behavior. It was the best outcome he could hope for. A terrifying thought for a man who just days earlier believed he was untouchable. As he prepared to fly back to California for the last time as a free man, Newsom sat in the back of a darkened SUV watching the D.C. Monuments slide past the window. He had come to this city to claim a throne, but he was leaving it to serve a sentence. The Golden State's favorite son was going home to face the music, and the first notes were already beginning to play. The sentencing hearing in Sacramento felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a final public exorcism of a political era. The courtroom was packed to its absolute capacity, with journalists, former staffers, and, most significantly, representatives from the communities Newsom had most deeply betrayed. Gavin Newsom sat at the defense table, his once impeccable appearance now noticeably frayed. The expensive suit hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight, and the famous architectural hair was finally beginning to show streaks of unmanaged gray. He sat with his head bowed, the posture of a man who had finally run out of exits. Behind him, the gallery was a sea of cameras and cold, judging eyes, all waiting to witness the formal fall of the Golden Boy. Judge Michael Fitzgerald, a man known for his unflinching adherence to the law and a reputation for a razor-sharp tongue, presided over the session. He spent over an hour reviewing the final victim impact statements, words from people who had lived in the shadow of the $68 billion void. When it finally came time for the sentencing, the room went so silent you could hear the hum of the courtroom's digital recording equipment. Fitzgerald didn't immediately read the sentence. Instead, he looked directly at Newsom, his eyes hard and full of a quiet, intellectual fury. He addressed the former governor not as a dignitary, but as a common thief who had utilized a high office to prey on the very people he had sworn to protect. "Mr. Newsom, you had everything," Judge Fitzgerald began, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You had wealth, you had influence, and you had a level of public trust that most politicians spend a lifetime dreaming of. You could have actually helped the people of this state, and you had the resources to change thousands of lives. Instead, you chose to treat the state treasury like a private piggy bank for your friends and your personal lifestyle. You stood on stages and spoke about moral imperatives while you were signing off on $850,000 studio apartments that were nothing more than a front for your donors' bank accounts. You spoke about empathy while you used taxpayer money to subsidize your own wineries and fund a life of luxury that 99% of your constituents will never know." The judge leaned forward, his finger tapping the thick stack of the final audit. "But the true tragedy of your actions isn't just the money, it is the body count. While you were counting your donations and celebrating at the French Laundry, the people you promised to save were dying on the sidewalks of our cities. Homeless deaths increased by nearly 50% on your watch, because the money that should have bought medicine and shelter was instead buying political ads and consulting fees for your inner circle. You betrayed the public trust in the most egregious, calculated way I have seen in my decades on the bench. I only wish the law allowed me to sentence you to more than the 10 years agreed upon in this plea deal, because 10 years in a cell doesn't begin to cover the damage you've done to the soul of this state." The sentence was then read: 10 years in a California state facility, with a mandatory restitution of $28 million and a permanent ban from ever holding public office or practicing law in the state again. Newsom was ordered to be remanded into custody immediately. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of camera shutters and whispered gasps as the bailiffs approached the defense table. The man who had once been the most powerful Democrat in the West was ordered to stand and place his hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut over his wrists was broadcast live to millions of people, a sharp metallic punctuation mark at the end of a 20-year career. As Newsom was led out through the side door, he didn't look back at the cameras or the gallery. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the 10-year sentence finally settling into his bones. The $1,500 suit was a relic now, a costume for a life that no longer existed. He was no longer a governor, a movie star politician, or a presidential hopeful. He was inmate #73849, a convicted felon headed toward a cell in Solano. The California way had officially hit a dead end, and as the courtroom emptied, the silence that remained was the only thing left of the legacy Gavin Newsom had spent a lifetime building. Gavin Newsom's arrival at California State Prison, Solano, was a surreal collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. Stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his dignity, the man who had once been the most powerful figure in the West was processed like any other inmate, fingerprinted, photographed in a coarse denim uniform, and assigned a thin mattress in a medium-security cell. The transition from the governor's mansion to inmate hash as 73,849 was a brutal psychological shock. The famous Newsom silhouette, once framed by the flags of the United States and California, was now silhouetted against cold cinder-block walls and a steel-framed bunk. The silence of his cell was perhaps the most agonizing part for a man whose life had been a constant whirlwind of applause, briefings, and televised speeches. The sudden absence of an audience felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The first year of his incarceration saw the total and systematic collapse of his personal life, a slow-motion disintegration that was tracked with morbid fascination by the national press. Just 6 months after he entered the gates of Solano, his wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, filed for divorce. The legal documents cited irreconcilable differences, but the subtext was clear to anyone following the news. The Newsom brand was radioactive, and she was moving to salvage what remained of her own future and that of their children. She kept the majority of their remaining assets, re-established her maiden name, and moved her life far from the shadow of the man who had become the face of California's largest corruption scandal. His children, once the frequent stars of his social media feeds, were now shielded by a wall of privacy, their last names changed to distance them from the $68 billion hole their father had left behind. Inside the prison walls, Newsom found himself in a peculiar type of isolation. While he was protected from the general population due to his high-profile status, he was not exempt from the realities of prison life. He was assigned to work in the prison library, a coveted position for nonviolent inmates, where he spent his days cataloging battered paperbacks and assisting other inmates with legal research. The former governor, who once dictated the policy of the world's fifth-largest economy, was now tasked with ensuring that a collection of worn-out thrillers and outdated textbooks remained in alphabetical order. He was frequently seen sitting at a small, scratched wooden desk, the famous golden boy looks fading under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the library. The gray in his hair, once a tactical touch of maturity, had now taken over completely, and his face had grown lean and gaunt from the stark prison diet. The outside world continued to move on without him, often with a cruelty that only politics can produce. The Democratic Party, which had once hailed him as its savior, had completely disowned him. His name was scrubbed from official party histories, and his former allies spent their televised interviews explaining how they had always harbored concerns about his administration's lack of oversight. Every failed homelessness project or crumbling infrastructure bridge was now labeled a Newsom legacy site, a permanent reminder of the billions that had vanished into a web of kickbacks and self-dealing. He was no longer a person. He was a cautionary tale, a rhetorical weapon used by both sides of the aisle to argue for transparency and the dangers of unchecked executive power. As the months turned into a year, the psychological toll of his fall became increasingly evident. On the rare occasions he was allowed visitors, Newsom appeared catatonic, his once vibrant conversational skills replaced by long, hollow silences. He spent hours staring at the television in the common room, watching the news cycle he used to control now revolve around his replacement, Eleni Kounalakis, and the reforms she was implementing to clean up his mess. He watched the Newsom rule being passed in Sacramento, a law specifically designed to prevent future governors from utilizing nonprofits for political money laundering. He was a living ghost, a man who could see the world he once ruled but could no longer touch. He was a man who had traded his legacy for a pile of money he could no longer spend. By the end of his first year, Gavin Newsom had become a student of his own destruction. He spent his nights in the library reading the audit reports the FBI had compiled against him, tracing the wire transfers and the emails with a clinical, detached curiosity. He finally understood the math that Trump had presented in the Oval Office. He saw the faces of the people who had died on the streets while he was dining at the French Laundry, and for the first time, the policy failure became a personal burden. The golden boy of California was gone, replaced by a graying man in a denim shirt who understood that his only remaining contribution to history was to serve as a warning of how easily a leader can lose their way when they start believing their own press clippings. The final gate of Solano State Prison creaked open on a crisp, indifferent morning, 6 years after Gavin Newsom had first entered its walls. He stepped out into the world not as the triumphant return of a political giant, but as a ghost returning to a society that had long since forgotten the sound of his voice. At 63, the man once defined by his Hollywood-caliber aesthetics and boundless energy was unrecognizable. The gray hair was now a shock of white. His skin had been weathered by years of institutional lighting and stress, and the sharp, predatory focus of his gaze had been replaced by a quiet, subdued introspection. He carried his few belongings in a small cardboard box, a modest final tally for a man who had once overseen the finances of the world's fifth-largest economy. There were no cameras waiting for him, no cheering supporters, and no motorcade. The Democratic Party had performed a total and surgical excision of his legacy, removing his name from every official building and returning every donation associated with his tenure. Even his own children had moved on under their mother's maiden name, living lives that were carefully walled off from the wreckage of his reputation. He was a man without a country and without a party. Following the advice of his remaining legal counsel, he did not return to the Bay Area or the wine country that had once been his fiefdom. Instead, he boarded a quiet commercial flight to Montana, moving to a small, isolated property he had managed to retain through a series of complex trusts. In the vast, silent expanse of the Bitterroot Valley, the former governor lived a life of deliberate, almost monastic obscurity. He spent his days maintaining the property and his evenings reading by a wood-burning stove. He was known to the few locals simply as Gavin, a quiet man who kept to himself and spent a great deal of time fly fishing in the freezing mountain streams. It was in this silence that the weight of the $68 billion finally seemed to settle into a permanent perspective. He was no longer the man who believed he was destined for the presidency. He was a man who understood that he had traded his soul for a pile of gold that he could no longer use and a prestige that had turned into a poison. He had wanted to be a part of history, and he had succeeded, but only as a cautionary chapter on the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. His final reflection on the nature of his fall came during a rare moment of candor with a local librarian, a man who had no idea of Gavin's past. They had been discussing the concept of legacy, and Newsom, looking out at the jagged peaks of the mountains, spoke with a clarity he never possessed behind a podium in Sacramento. The danger of being a golden boy is that you start to believe the light is coming from you rather than reflecting off you, he remarked quietly. You think you are untouchable because you are told you are every single day. You stop seeing the people you're supposed to serve and start seeing them as data points to support your own story. By the time I realized I was a thief, the theft was so large that I couldn't see the exit anymore. Back in California, the state continued its slow, painful recovery from the era of systematic corruption. The Newsom rule had successfully insulated the state treasury from similar predatory schemes, and the homelessness crisis, while still a daunting challenge, was finally being addressed with a level of transparency that had been absent for decades. The $23 billion in recovered funds had been funneled into actual brick-and-mortar facilities and comprehensive mental health programs. The people Newsom had failed, the teachers, the veterans, and the families on the brink, were finally seeing the support that had been promised to them years prior. The California Way was no longer a slogan for a personal brand. It had become a blueprint for rebuilding public trust through accountability. Gavin Newsom died quietly in the winter of 2038, a decade after his release. His passing was a footnote in the national news, a brief reminder of a scandal that felt like it belonged to a different century. He was buried in an unmarked plot in Montana, far from the halls of power and the cameras he had once courted with such intensity. His Wikipedia entry remained a brutal, unyielding summary of a career defined by its collapse, a permanent digital record of the man who chose the French Laundry over the needs of the forgotten. The Golden Boy had eventually found his peace, not in the adulation of the crowds or the grandeur of the Oval Office, but in the cold, honest silence of the mountains, finally understanding that the only thing that lasts is the truth.